Hey guys, welcome to DevTech Finance, and in this video we would be covering factoring. As we all know that today with the development of various financial services, factoring is also emerging as one of the most used financial services being provided in this business. So let's get an easy overview about this business. Introduction. Factoring can be defined as an agreement in which the receivables arising out of sale of goods and services are sold by a firm to the factor, as a result of which the title to the goods or services represented by the receivables passes on to the factor. So, what happens is that about three parties are involved in this business. So let's assume there is a seller, a buyer, and a factor. So the seller on selling goods on credit to the buyer. The seller who is selling the goods on credit to the buyer. Now he would be getting the payment for those goods or services in future period of time, which was agreed between the buyer and the seller. Now if the seller comes in an requirement of instant cash for the business, which he cannot miss on the opportunity which is requiring some kind of cash in the business. Now the seller is running out of the cash and the payments is going to come into future. Now what it can do, it can try to get the service from the factor. Now factor would be purchasing the receivables, or another way around we can say that the seller would be selling the invoices or the receivables that was raised from the buyer to the factor. The factor here is acting as a financial intermediary. It may be any financial institution. Now the factor would be purchasing those receivables from the seller and would be providing an instant cash amount of about 80 to 85% of the receivable. Now the seller was in need of the cash, so he got that from the factor. The factor has purchased the receivables or invoices from the seller. So now the factor would be responsible for taking all the future payments from the debtors who has purchased the goods or services from the seller. Now, this is how the whole factoring business is working. So, the need of the seller is being fulfilled over here. The factor is charging some kind of commission or service charges for providing this service of discounting the receivables. And other than that, the buyer would be making the payment to the factor as decided. So this is all about factoring business. Now let's understand it in simple words that factoring as a fund-based financial service provides resources to finance receivables as well as facilitates the collection of receivables. So any firm who is providing factoring services is assuring the seller that the amount the firm would be paying instantly as cash, and all the receivables the payment would be recovered by the factor at the future specified period of time from the buyer. Credit sales generate the factoring business. So this business is being generated by credit sales. Because of the credit sales which are being made by the seller, the invoices are raised of future payments, and these invoices are then being sold to the factor who would be raising the payments from the buyer. So the whole business is being generated through the credit sales. Through factoring, receivables are instantly covered into cash, leading to fund flow for business growth. So as I already mentioned, if there would be any requirement of cash and the firm is running out of the cash, so it can get in this way by selling the receivables to the factor and can utilize all the opportunities for the business growth right at that period of time. Let's move forward and look at the parties involved in this business. So till now you must have got a gist about the buyer, the seller and the factor. Let's simply understand it in a more defined manner. Buyer receives delivery of goods with invoice and instructions by seller to make payment to the factor on due date. Buyer makes payment to factor in time or gets extension of time, or in the case of default, it's subject to legal proceedings by the factor. So when the buyer is receiving the good or service from the seller, he's also raising a kind of invoice and instruction to make the payment to the factor on the due date. And in case if the buyer would be defaulting on this payment, he or she may be subject to legal proceedings by the factor in case of non-recourse factoring. Seller is one who sells good on credit to the buyer and receive invoices for future payment. Now the seller in requirement of cash could receive about 80% of payment in advance on selling these invoices or receivables to the factor. Factor, for providing this service, deduct its service charges from the receivables amount. Now, who is the factor over here? Factor is any entity or institution who is providing this kind of service, who is taking the receivables and providing the instant cash amount. The factor enters into an agreement with the seller for rendering factoring services to him. On receiving the invoices, the factor makes payment of about 80% to 85% of the price of debt to the seller. Factor collects the amount from buyer on behalf of receivables purchased from seller and remits rest money to seller after deducting its service charges. So about 80 to 85% of payment is made by the factor right at that period of time when the seller gives the receivables to the factor. Rest of the amount the factor pays on receiving it from the buyer, the actual debtor, after deducting the service charges of whatever services it has provided to the seller. Let's move forward and have a look at the services provided by factor. So these are some of the services which are provided by a factor. It is collection of receivables. This is the main service, as we have seen that on collecting the invoices, the factor becomes responsible for collecting the amount due on the debtors in behalf of the seller. Second is maintenance of sales ledger. So in this the factor tries to maintain the whole sales ledger on the received amount, the date of receipts, when how much amount is yet to be received, and what are the data's information. The whole ledger is being prepared by the factor over there. It maintains and tries to collect the amounts on the due date and matches the receipt and the payment date. Other than that, the factor also provides some kind of advisory services. Because of being involved in all this credit business, the factoring firm comes to be is well versed with the kind of rules and regulation involved in the credit business, the services involved, what are the credit risk and defaults from the side of the buyers in terms of receivables, in terms of collection. So all these kind of advisory services the factor also tends to provide on the basis of its data collection, on the basis of its experience in that particular business. Other than that, it finances the trade debts. So taking the debt obligations and financing to the firm, to the seller, is the main core business of the factor. Credit protection also. When we will talk about the non-recourse factoring, we will see that how credit protection is provided by the factor by taking the defaults of the bad debts on its own rather than on the seller. Let's move forward to the types of factoring, starting with the recourse factoring. In this factoring service, if the buyer turns out to default on making the payment of receivable amount, the factor does not bear this loss of credit risk and is entitled to recover the amount from the seller. So in recourse factoring, the services is being provided by the factor is same, but what happens that if the buyer from which it has to receive the payment in the future defaults on making the payment of that particular amount, the factor will not bear the risk of this loss. The factor will then go to the seller and is entitled to recover the amount from the seller. Second is the non-recourse factoring. It is just opposite of recourse factoring. In this, the loss arising out of default buyers or irrecoverable receivable is borne by factor himself. For this reason of handling defaults, factor is non-recourse facility charge higher commission. So as in recourse factoring, the factor was not bearing the risk of any kind of default made by the buyer, but in case of non-recourse factoring, the factor is itself bearing the risk of the losses which would be arising out of the default. And for this service, the factor would be charging higher commission as compared to recourse factoring. Then there is a full factoring, which combines the feature of almost all factoring services like collection, credit protection, sales ledger maintenance, bad debt spawn, etc. Disclosed factoring. In this, the name of factor is disclosed in the invoice by the supplier of the goods, asking buyer to make payment to the factor. So disclosed factoring discloses the name of that entity which is serving as the factor and asking the buyer to make the payment on the name of that particular entity only who is serving as a factor. So the name is disclosed to the buyer, to whom the buyer has to make the payment. But when we talk about the undisclosed factoring, the name of factor is not disclosed in the invoice. The entire realization of business transaction is done in the name of supplier or the seller and not on the name of the factor. Factor just acts as an intermediary, but the buyer is not aware of that. The name is not disclosed. So all the transactions are being done on the name of seller itself. Then there is advance factoring. The factor pays a pre-specified portion ranging between 3 to 4th of the factored receivables in advance, the balance being paid upon the collection of the guaranteed date. So the factor pays a pre-specified portion, about 3/4 of the factored receivables in advance. As we said, about it could range between 70 to 80% of the amount, and rest is being paid on receiving that amount on receiving the amount which was due from the buyer on that particular guaranteed date. Whereas in maturity factoring, what happens? It is also known as collection factoring. In this arrangement, the factor does not make prepayment to client. The payment is made only on the date of collection or the guaranteed payment date. Then there is domestic factoring, where the factoring arrangement of all three parties, the seller, buyer and factor, are in the same country, the same domicile country. And international factoring, where the factoring arrangement is such that seller and buyer are in two different countries. Coming to the Factoring Regulation Act, this is the act which governs the whole factoring business as such, so that any kind of malpractices or manipulations does not happen in this business. So the registration of factors to be approved entity to do this business, assignment of receivables, all the receivables which has to be received by the factor, and the terms and conditions of recourse and non-recourse factoring, the rights and obligation of the parties to the contract. So what would be the rights and obligation? What would be the rights of buyer, the seller and the factor, depending on the type of factoring services they are getting involved into? Registration of assignments, as well as the offences and penalties in case of any kind of default, fraud or manipulation happening in this business. So all these things are governed and regulated by Factoring Regulation Act. So this was all for this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you liked this video. Do like and subscribe to my channel, DevTech Finance. Thank you all.